the Financial Survival Network, helping you to survive and thrive in the new economy. To find out where to buy gold and silver reliably at great prices, go get your free Financial Survival Toolkit at financialsurvivalnetwork.com. You'll also get our complimentary newsletter. This is the Financial Survival Network.
1490 WGCH. This is Kerry Lutz, and you're listening to the Financial Survival Network, which is brought to you by Miles Franklin. They've been in business selling gold and silver for over 20 years, and I'm a customer because when you buy, they ship. For more information, find them on the web at milesfranklin.com or give them a call at 800-822-8080 and get a free quote. You got to face the facts. We're living in a kleptocracy. Doesn't matter what country in the world you inhabit, what country you call home, you know that the corruption is running rampant, that the government isn't really out there to help you. It's actually out there to line the pockets of the various interest groups, the so-called crony capitalists who are not capitalists, they're fascists. That's what government has devolved into. One of our fellow freedom fighters from the land down under, from Australia, Joanne Nova, she's been fighting the fight for years. She's on with us now. Joanne, how are you?
Oh, Kerry, well, how are you?
Doing great, doing great. I mean, the word is getting out. I wouldn't say I'm a raving optimist about things, but I do believe that eventually the truth wins out. And whether the people fighting for the truth win or not, I don't know the answer to that. But there's always reason to be hopeful, right?
Well, there is, Kerry, there is. And as you so aptly said, we seem to be winning. We are winning. We are. But the most important thing is we have to keep up the pressure at this point because people are busy transitioning. They recognise that they need to retreat, so they're retreating and finding new ground. But we need to make sure we keep free access to the internet because without the internet, we are lost. We need that coverage, the ability to do free speech. And that at the moment is a bit under siege. In Australia, there are threats to censor the internet, to regulate blogs and what you're allowed to say, which is just extraordinary. And because, as you said, we need to keep an eye on these people who are spending our money. Right now, I believe there are 45,000 of them in Rio spending our money and having a party on the beach. And, of course, a lot of them are doing a lot of work as well. And I don't want to suggest that everybody there is just there for a good time. But ultimately, the whole deal with Rio, well, look, in terms of a career, who wouldn't like to be invited to go to Rio and, stay there for a conference and meet other like-minded people? So, but you can hardly blame them for saying yes, please, to the offer to go there. But we ought to be asking the governments who sponsor these enormous shindigs what is going on, why we need to have them there, and is it a good idea to throw money at the UN in the first place? We don't get to vote for any of these people, and yet some of the stories coming out of Rio are really quite extraordinary. I don't know if you're aware, Mark Morano from Climate Depot is down there, and he said it's unprecedented. He has never seen them shut down access to the NGOs and non-governmental people who are allowed to be at this conference, but are not allowed to see the text on the treaties and not allowed to be involved at all in what's going on that's being negotiated behind closed doors by government officials. Where is the transparency?
This is a panic move, last-ditch power grab that they know they're on the ropes and they're just going for it. They're going to try to grab as much as they possibly can.
And it's about power. And in a sense, they've already got it because they're already spending millions of our dollars flying to remote tropical places. And sure enough, they have to do work some of the time. But let's face it, as I said, how many people would turn down a trip to Rio? So ultimately, they have got something that the rest of the population would like to have, which is a lifestyle where they get their trips paid for to go overseas and do things. So it's a junket and the industry is large, and I think we need to recognise that in itself is an endpoint, a goal, not to have to compete with people to make products that you have to compete with everyone else on, but where you get the run, where you're the regulator, you set the rules and you get to go on the trips.
Yeah, that's a funny thing because we have this ultra-right talk show host in the U.S. by the name of Rush Limbaugh. And, he's anti-liberal, pro-freedom, but pro-existing system. And it's kind of hard to be both, I think. But he does a spoof where John McCain was running for president last time, and he's talking about how I'm going to pass a new law in the Environmental Protection Act, and that's going to create jobs for lobbyists and expanding lobbyist offices and lawyers, and I'm going to help you find a job that way. And that's what they're doing with all these ridiculous regulations and jobs. The only sector expanding across the globe is the government, and that's because there's no accountability, and they just spend the money, and there is no measurement as to how productive these people are, thank goodness, because if they were really productive, we would have all been in chains a long time ago.
Well, that is the thing, isn't it? We do joke about exactly that. Yes, I've heard a story about our own Department of Climate Change here in Australia, which is that they are moving to offices which will be 7-star rating, and which is great energy rating. But in order to do it, they've had to move their computers and whatnot off-site to a different place because they burn up lots of electricity. So everyone in the office will be sitting there sending their messages back and forward to buildings far away using their keyboard and screen in front of them, so that they're not burning so much energy on site in order to score that 7-star rating. I mean, how meaningless can you get? And worse than that is that they're being forced to use smaller screens, I hear, as a rumour. And you think, what is that going to do to productivity? And I think it's probably good for Australia.
Yeah. We had this comedian around the turn of the century in the U.S. by the name of Will Rogers. And he said about Congress, every time they make a law, it's a joke. And every time they make a joke, it becomes a law. And, the guy was just homespun wit from Oklahoma. And that's what we're faced with. And it's so refreshing to hear that the dysfunctionality, if that's a word, that is prevalent across the U.S., the impossibility to run things, it's happening all over the world. And I believe it's happening in China, Russia, and that's leading to a rejection, I believe, of government authority, of government legitimacy. I think the government is running into a crisis where people are starting to question its legitimacy. And that, to me, is a good thing. Yes. And this is exactly the point that I keep making on my blog, is that they will ask for all they can get. They will ask until something stops them. It's a kind of ever-increasing government force. And the only thing that will stop them is what? Us. So we're going to protest now, or we can wait and protest later. But basically, if we don't protest now, they're just going to ask for more, and we'll end up protesting from a weaker position. So we need to take the bull by the horns and do it now, because the longer we wait, the worse it gets. Hey, it's once those handcuffs are on you, Joanne, it's real hard to get them off. And and those handcuffs might be just the paper that stops you running your business, that ties you up for hours every day filling in forms to stop you making money, or to make just enough to keep the business running, but not enough to give you the time to go and read the internet and find out what's going on and join the rallies to oppose these things. Hey, that is a wonderful point, because being a debt/tax slave really focuses your efforts on just survival and not on the higher things of what the watchers are doing, what the government's doing. And it's like this all over the so-called free world. And I never thought I'd live to see the day where it would be easier to open a business in Shanghai than it is to open a business in New York City. But that's where we're at now.
It is indeed scary, and I think the word for it is this is crazy, hey? Ineptocracy. I'm looking at the word. I've said it so many times.
Idiocracy.
Yeah, no, the ineptocracy. Yeah, and of course, you've probably seen that one doing the rounds on the internet. It's just a great description. A system of government where the least capable to lead are elected by the least capable of producing, and where members of society least likely to sustain themselves or succeed are the ones rewarded with goods and services paid for by the confiscated wealth of a diminishing number of producers.
Wow, that's
the
worthy.
Ruled by the inept. I mean, this is where we're at. They're inept enough not to be able to produce, but they're very good at setting up regulations and creating the scene to support the increase in more regulations.
It's exactly the same thing in the U.S. And what we have here is a diminishing system of federalism where states still do have the ability to set important policies where you go to Texas, Florida, and 7 other states, there's no state income tax. Regulations are less. Not to say that these places are panaceas by any stretch, because liberalism and statism has infiltrated every government office and every legislature and every governor's office, regardless what they say, in the nation. You know, the concept of our founding fathers here in the United States of limited government, a non-professional class of leaders who would basically give up their farm, go to Washington or the state capitol, serve for a couple of years, and then go back to their business. That's dead. You know, we've got this parasitic class. They're total parasites. Professional politicians, absolutely, who do nothing else. We have the same thing here, and as you said, it's all across the West, the same thing. It's a cancer. It's like it's metastasized.
Well, that's exactly it. It is that way. And that's what I mean when I say that government will simply grow, because the lobbyists create more rules and regulations by encouraging that kind of thing. Some of the businesses get sucked into thinking that's a good thing, like some here recently. We had a great example up north of where I live, and I live on the west coast of Australia. There's a beautiful place called Shark Bay, which has extraordinary reefs, Ningaloo, just wild remote reef, brilliant stuff. And it has whale sharks, the giant, the hugest fish in the sea. About in the early 90s, one of the fishermen noticed that they could get their boats quite close to these whale sharks, and the whale sharks didn't seem to mind. And what a spectacular view. So he set up a tourist industry based on that, which seemed like a great idea. Now, within a few years, there were 2 or 3 operators doing the same thing. And he suddenly thought, well, gee, maybe it would be a good idea if we licensed this, because if everyone had to have a license, I wouldn't have so much competition and there wouldn't be any newcomers coming in to take over my turf and the idea. So he phones up the West Australian local government, the state government here, and he says, you know, could we get a licence? Well, 3 weeks later, wouldn't you know, there are people on his doorstep saying, of course you can. And before you know it, they all needed licensing, and the government said, and we will renew that licence every 12 months. So who controlled the situation here? The government, of course. And within a few years, he was out of business. I'm not quite sure what the details of that were, but he was not any longer up there in that position. And now
Serves him right. Serves him right.
Yeah, I think so too, because ultimately competition is the answer, isn't it? He tried to find a shortcut and it came back and bit him. Yeah. But the government now runs that and licenses it and sends up auditors who know nothing about what's going on. And there are great stories coming out of that wild remote area. Well, but unfortunately, yes, it is all overrun now with governments.
That's a template.
Government hand. So it's a lesson to business people out there that you can't seek a shortcut answer. Yeah. By hoping the government will be on your side, because the regulators end up being on the regulator's side.
Yeah, well, that's a template. It happens all the time in every industry that gets regulated. And I don't know how the taxi industry works in Australia, but for instance, in New York City, you have these medallions and the number is restricted and they're worth $275,000 US a piece now because you have a monopoly.
Here.
Yeah, every major city in the world works that way, and the situation you described with the whale shark tourist boats, it's exactly the same. Always works that way. That's crony capitalism. That's government bestowing unfair advantages and then taking them away. The government giveth, the government taketh away. Speaking of which, climate change. We have China basically rejecting the EU's carbon tax credit on commercial aircraft. You've been following that?
Oh, and isn't it sad that it comes down to the fact where I feel grateful that China is not playing the game and isn't in on the run, because it's sad to say that I'm relying on people and countries like Russia and China to help us keep our freedom. In Australia, of course, we'll be hugely affected if they tax airlines, because we're the longest, we're a long way from anywhere, even Antarctica. So when we get on a plane, we have to spend hours on it and we have to pay a lot of money. And if they bring in those taxes, it's going to be terrible for our tourism industry, because who's going to want to pay extra money to come out and visit Australia? Australia, where the exchange rate is already prohibitively high. But yes, so it's horrible to think what the EU is trying to do there, and it's great to see China stand up to it. But oh my goodness, imagine one plane on the tarmac in China that's not allowed to leave, and the whole world's attention will be pinpoint focused on that every minute until that situation is resolved.
You know, it just amazes me, Joanne, that we're having the climate change debate when it has been so thoroughly and totally debunked by the ClimateGate memos that have come out, emails showing that the whole thing is a fraud, it's a scam, and it's a power grab. It's a way for investment banks to corner markets. It's anti-progress, anti-liberty, anti-improving human beings' standards of living, the whole thing while you work.
It's not just anti-standards of living. It actually kills people. I mean, who can forget the biofuels debacle where corn is fed to cars instead of fed to people? And India Gokhlani showed that in 2010, 200,000 people probably died because they couldn't get enough food to eat. They couldn't afford to eat food because the price of corn and whatnot rose. And, you know, kids in Haiti went without meals and starved because people were feeding corn to cars.
40%.
It gives people these bad decisions. It's awful. So we need to stop this and stop pretending that there is no cost, that there is no price to buying this global insurance that we're supposed to be needing in case the world warms slightly.
Do you know that 40% of the U.S. corn crop goes to make ethanol? And then we get 40%. Lousier mileage on our cars because we have a 10% ethanol requirement. We're then subsidizing it because nobody wants the stuff. The oil industry does not want it. It causes nothing but trouble for refineries because it has to be added at the end of the process and mixed in a special way because alcohol and gasoline do not mix, contrary to popular belief. And it's just this mass insanity and it's delusional. I mean, I just wake up every morning and I look at the blogs, I look at some newspapers, and I just say, how are they going to screw us today? What are they going to do today that I wasn't expecting? What act of stupidity are they going to come up with that will make your life harder, that will further impoverish you, and that will really diminish your life? What are they going to do to you today? That's what everybody needs to wake up every morning and say, what will they do to us today? What are they planning? Right?
We've got about a week to go before we get a carbon tax.
Is that really going to go through?
Go through, yeah. It's legislation. It's supposed to start a week from now. And the bills are starting to come through. The electricity suppliers and whatnot are announcing the rises. I think in South Australia, one of the main states, one of the rises coming through is looking at 18% from their major electricity provider. And because our population density is a lot lower than in the US, we tend to have one often government-run but sometimes privatised monopoly in a state running the electricity, which is a kind of crazy situation. You end up with the government trying to make rules about how much they're allowed to charge and what they need to do and all kinds of things like that as these government semi-quasi-monopolies end up running. But yes, 18% rise in the price and only, I think, 8% of that or something. And I better not get this wrong, goodness me, because if I do, I could be fined up to $1.1 million for claiming that the price of carbon was causing an enormous price rise. But yeah, it was 18%. That was not just carbon, that was also other rises. And a lot of it turned out to be solar. Those panels we stick on roofs and things like that, we've subsidised them to the point where they are even outdoing the carbon tax in some states in terms of the cost to the public. But our electricity bills are going through the roof. So it is really starting to hurt here. And especially if we end up with a few cold years. We live in a warm country, but our houses and whatnot are not necessarily well equipped to deal with the cold.
Well, you know what Joanne, you know what they were doing in Spain, because there's a mandatory buyback by the utilities of the electric being produced by these solar cells. And this is in the US too. And the subsidy was so great that people were buying diesel generators and they were generating electricity at a phenomenally high price and selling that back to the utility at a profit. And this is what happens when government puts its thumb on the scale of the market. You wind up with malinvestment and irrational decision-making that is only rational from the standpoint of how you cash in on poorly thought out, improvident government programs.
And Kerry, with the diesel producers of solar electricity in Spain, you remember how they were caught?
I don't remember that.
I leapt a little bit too far ahead then, didn't I? With that solar subsidy that was going on, it became so profitable to produce solar power. People bought diesel generators, stuck them near the solar power panels, and they ran them at night time when the solar panels didn't work.
Right, that's right. They were running them at night. Yeah, that's right, yes. right.
Yeah, so somebody finally noticed that, gee, we're getting solar power coming in at nighttime, and wondered and followed the links to find these diesel generators operating. I mean, if the diesel guys had been smart enough to stick a $10 timer clock on it and switch them off at sunrise and sunset, then maybe they would have got away with it.
Yeah, well, they did for such a long time. Isn't it amazing? But this is what government intervention in any marketplace causes. Nobody out there is smart enough to know what a policy that implemented now will have, even when it goes into effect, or 2 years from now, or 40 years from now, like Social Security in the United States. That's why the government needs to get the hell out of our business.
Well, and to be honest, I think that's one of those things. If you're born lucky enough, as we are, to have the genes to be self-sufficient, to think for yourself and to be able to provide for yourself, then the world is not as scary as it would be for the vast range of people who didn't get so lucky in the great genetic lottery. And from their point of view, I can see, and there makes a lot of sense, it's quite rational and quite smart to want big government in that sense, because for them, they're competing with the other self-sufficient ones. And who wants to rely on the charity of anyone? No one does. So if the government says, well, if you can't get a job, we'll guarantee a payment to you. And if you're a single mum and you have babies and you didn't think too hard about it and plan ahead, then we'll provide food on the table. Then I guess for that half of the gene pool that didn't get lucky, it's a lot easier to live that way.
It is, but it isn't, because that leads to resentment. Dependency always leads to resentment upon the person or institution that you're dependent upon. It leads to the producers who are being unfairly forced to subsidize the non-producers to produce less at some point. And then you have a spiral, which is kind of where we're at now, which you see doctors in the States saying, yes, if I work an extra 10 hours a week, I'm paying 55% of it to the government, and then the insurance companies are going to screw me anyway. Who needs it? I'm not going to bother. And then you have lower productivity. And the fact is that risk-taking, entrepreneurism, self-determination, individualism, that's what has led us to this era of prosperity, and anything that undermines that is going to make us all poorer and really injure society and the world as a whole.
Well, I quite agree, but it's one of those things that's difficult, and we need to tackle that fear that people have if we want to help train everyone to understand how we are all better off, because what they're missing out on a lot of the time are the things they can't see. No one can see the productivity gains or the inventions that would have happened if we had have been a freer society for the last 10 years without the burden of all these silly environmental rules and laws. Somehow we need to help the people understand that while they think they're getting cheap electricity having the solar panels on their roof, that actually it's a net loss to everyone as well as them, and that if we hadn't have had those rules, then they would have been able to afford better healthcare with a doctor of their choice and things like that, because we all would have been paying less tax, been more productive. They would have had better paying jobs because the employers would have been able to. Do you see what I mean? There's a whole
absolutely.
Rock-on effect here, but we have to deal with that mentality and that attitude from people because it's very real and it's quite understandable. And I guess for people who are getting older and don't understand how the current system works or are afraid for their health, and that's so common and realistic for people who are older, they know their medical expenses are going to go up. I can understand why they find it so appealing, this idea that the government will look after them.
Well, it's a false sense of security, and, the world has always been a threatening, kind of dangerous place to us all. This quest for security, I think, is human nature, but the cost of security is often way more than the benefits that are derived from it. Joanne, we got to get going now. People want to learn more about you, read your blog. Where should they go?
Well, joannenova.com.au, thanks. And yes, leave a comment, come and say hello. We'd love to hear from you. And yes, the big government question is something facing all of us around Western economies.
Yeah. We'll talk more again. You be well.
Thank you.